Assalamualaikum and hello. Today we're going to learn about the reflect arc and also the reflect action. So the reflect arc is the nervous pathway of neurons for the transmission of impulse. So that's mean it's actually like a road or the highway for the impulse to passes through. Okay, imagine for a second like the impulse is like the vehicles and the reflect arc is actually the road. So in order for the vehicle to move from point A to point B, it needs a road. So that is how the reflect arc coming from. Okay, but the differences is in the reflect arc is made by three type of road, which is known as neuron, which is the sensory neuron and the relay neuron and then the motor neuron. So just remember that the reflect arc here is actually the pathway of neurons. I mean the pathway that is made by neurons so that the impulse can be transmitted. Okay, and then we have the reflex action. As the name suggested, it is actually the action or the response that is performed by the effector organ. So the reflex action is automatic response to a stimulus, and also the reflex action is unconscious. We cannot decide, we cannot think, and it just happened very fast and automatic. So in the reflex arc, okay, it will start off with the receptor cell in the sense organ, meaning in a reflex arc the first part of the pathway is from the receptor cell that is coming from the sense organ. So for example, this is the skin. So in the skin we have a lot of receptor cells such as the heat receptor, the pain receptor, the pressure, so on and so forth. So because of this organ, the skin organ have receptor in it, so it's known as the sense organ. Okay, so next the next pathway is the sensory neuron. As you can see, before this we already learned about the sensory neuron. We easily can differentiate between the sensory, the relay, and motor when we look at the cell body. As you can see, the cell body of the sensory neuron is located at the middle of the nerve fibers. So next after the receptor cell will be the sensory neuron. Okay, before I forget, what happened in between is the impulse is being transmitted. The impulse will be generated here because we have the stimulus here. The sharp pin will be the stimulus. Okay, if there is no stimulus, then the receptor cell will not generate any impulse. Okay, so because there is the stimulus there, the sharp pin, so the receptor cell will produce impulse and the impulse will be transmitted along the sensory neuron. So next is the relay neuron. So the relay neuron is located here in this spinal cord. Okay, if you can remember, the spinal cord is the part that form the CNS, and usually this CNS is just consists of majority of it just consists of relay neuron. So next the impulse will be traveled from the sensory neuron to the relay neuron. After that is the motor neuron. So the impulse now after it passes through the relay neuron, it will passes through along the motor neuron here. How can we know that this is actually the motor neuron? First, we look at the cell body. As you can see, the cell body of motor neuron is inside the spinal cord. Okay, compared to the sensory neuron, the cell body is not located inside the spinal cord. Okay, that is the first. The second is As you can see here, this is the nerve ending. The nerve ending of the motor neuron is attached to this particular effector known as muscles. So that is how we know motor neuron. So next, after the impulse passes through the motor neuron, it will passes through and finally arrive to a destination, which is the effector. Okay, so the effector here can, and no, it has two types. The first one is the muscle, then the second one is the glands, such as the pituitary gland, the adrenal gland. Usually this gland will produce hormone, but we are not going to cover that today. Okay, so at the end of the reflex arc is when the impulse arrive at the effector. Why it arrive at effector is because the effector, whether it's muscle or gland, the effector is the component that will produce response so that the action can take place. Okay, so we are going to look how the impulse is traveled through this reflex arc. So we see this is actually the impulse. As you can see, the impulse travel from the receptor cell and then going through the sensory neuron and then passes through the relay neuron, then along the motor neuron, and then finally it arrives at the effector, which is the muscle in this diagram. So let's continue to the reflex action. It basically, you need to know the story behind it. We need to know how the response is achieved, how actually the impulse is created, where does it go, what happened to the impulse, and how finally it arrived to the effector. Okay, for the reflex arc, we just know that it is just a pathway that start from the uh, sense organ, the receptor cell, and then sensory neuron, and then relay neuron, and then the motor neuron, and then finally the effector. So for the reflex action, is actually involuntary action, meaning you cannot control, you have no power over the movement. It's like it's happened suddenly. For example, for involuntary action is when you swallow the water. So when the water passes through your throat or esophagus, you cannot control it, so it is involuntary. And then it is not conscious, meaning unconsciously you will not know that you perform this reflection. I mean, during the reflection take place, you will not conscious about, you will not aware about it. After you make the response, then you're aware. Okay, like when you touch something hot, you withdraw your hand first, and then you respond, ouch, so painful, why I touched that things, something like that. And then the reflex action is automatic and also very fast. Why it needs to be automatic? Because if it needed the body to respond, then maybe we are in a great danger. I mean, like when we touch something that is very hot, if it's not automatic, then it will pause for maybe 5 seconds to think what to respond, and by the meantime our hand is burned. Okay, and it's actually very fast. If the reflex action is not very fast, it might danger ourselves. Our hand might be burned if we touch something that is very hot and the reflex is not fast enough. Okay, and then for the reflection, it will involve sensory, relay, and motor neuron using the reflex arc. But remember though, there is one reflex action that does not involve relay neuron, that is known as the knee-jerk reflex. In the knee-jerk reflex, okay, It only involves sensory and motor neuron. Okay, we are going to cover that later on. Okay, next we are going to look at the reflex action. What happened along the way? What are actually the action that will be made after a stimulus has been detected? So first thing first, in the reflex arc, if you still can remember, it starts with the receptor cell. So what happened is, if there is stimulus, for example, when this person put his hand on the burning Bunsen burner, the receptor cells in the skin of his hand will detect the stimulus, which is the heat. Okay, so what happened after the receptor cell detect the stimulus? It will generate the impulse. So the first generation of impulse is made or produced by the receptor cells. But please take note that the impulse will be generated by the receptor cell in the presence of the stimulus. Okay, what happened when the impulse has been generated by the receptor cell is the impulse. Okay, remember the impulse need to arrive at the brain for integration, for the brain to know what are the steps to perform after it detect the stimulus. So the impulse will travel along the sensory neuron. So as you can see, we have the sensory neuron. So the impulse will travel all along the sensory neuron here to the relay neuron here, which is located at the central nervous system. In this particular method, it is the spinal cord. Okay, right. So as you can see here, if you watch it closely, you might find that actually the neuron have a gap between them. So from one neuron to one neuron is actually the neuron does not touching each other. It has some tiny little gap there. Okay, so this gap is known as synaptic gap. Okay, this gap here is known as synaptic gap or synaptic cleft. Okay, meaning they are not touching each other. The nerve ending of the sensory neuron is not touching the dendrite of the relay neuron because of this synaptic gap. Okay, so what happened is the impulse needed to pass through from the sensory to relay. So in order to make that happen, synapse will occur. So synapse is just a process where the impulse is being generated by the relay neuron. Okay, later on we are going to cover about the synapse, but don't worry, for now you already for now what you need to know is, after the impulse travel on the sensory neuron to relay neuron, synapse occur between each of the neuron. So in this particular case, okay, as you can see here, we have one and we have two synapse that will occur. Okay, and then what happened is the synapse now just arrive at the relay neuron, and then relay neuron will generate new impulse, and then this impulse will pass through the motor neuron. So the impulse will travel from the relay neuron to the motor neuron, and then the impulse will travel from the motor neuron to the effector. In this particular case is the bicep muscle. It is very important that you look and you observe carefully all the details in the question. Sometimes the labels that they put in the diagram is actually a hint for the answer, or a word that must put in the answer. So we know, right, the effector, the if you know what is the effector, then you will know that the bicep muscle is actually one of the example of the effector. So now the bicep muscles receive the new impulse that is generated from the relay neuron. So what happened is the new impulse tell the biceps to contract. Why the bicep need to contract? Because it need to withdraw the hand. So the response would be the hand will be lift over, and then the person does not feel the pain anymore. Why the hand can be lifted over? Because the bicep muscle receive the impulse. Okay, next let's look at the animation of the impulse on how the impulse is travel along the reflex action. So this will be the impulse. So as you can see, the impulse slowly travel, it's very fast actually. It's travel from the sensory, and then from the relay to the relay, and then to the effector by the motor neuron. Now let's look at this diagram and study it carefully in order to write down the answer if the question asks you about to explain or describe about the reflex action. You may need to focus on each of the structure that the question label. It is very helpful.